Hello friends, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anurekha Chariwag, Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. Today we are going to discuss a module titled Indian Peasantry and the National Movement, Part 2. This module is part of the paper Agrarian Social Structure and Change that is coordinated by Dr. Manish Thakur of IIM Kolkata. In this module on Indian peasantry and national movement, we are going to focus on the relationship between individual presence and the national movement. We are going to look into how the peasant politics have played an important role in shaping the nationalist politics. We have also looked into how the implication of this intermeshing of Indian peasantry and nationalist politics and national movement has really led to the way we define peasant politics in India. In this module, we offer you an overview of differing assessments of the interface between Indian peasantry and the Indian national movement. This module tells you about the ways in which peasants' politics got enmeshed with the nationalist politics. It also looks at the implications of this intermeshing for both peasant politics and nationalism. Peasant and nationalism. One finds a definite congruence between the boundaries of influence of peasant movement and national movement. In other words, there is less or negligible incidences of peasant resistance in the areas not under the influence of Indian national movement. This makes it clear that the mobilization of the peasantry was largely contingent upon nationalist mobilization. By mobilizing peasantry, the Indian national movement created a new political awareness and awakening among the peasants. In the process, Indian national movement also made peasants receptive to more radical and class-oriented ideas. Moreover, the peasants provided political cadres and workers to the national movement. After all, for colonial people, nationalism offers powerful elemental urge to fight united against a common enemy. On the contrary, class ideology has little chance of success if pitted against nationalism. Though there have been instances where class-based and nationalist mobilizations have gone hand in hand, most prominently in the case of Chinese Revolution. These exceptions apart, nationalism has turned out to be an historically appropriate progressive ideology providing basis of unity and common struggle to different strata of peasantry that was divided on caste, religion, language, class and along similar other axes. In many countries, it has been seen that modern nationalist political consciousness acts as a precursor of class consciousness. In most cases, peasant political consciousness and nationalist consciousness emerge together in mutually constitutive ways. In fact, there is an organic and dialectical process binding the two. The common drive of both nationalist and peasant political consciousness being to reach out to each other. Also, any understanding of the role of the peasantry in revolutionary transformations in the modern world, including the nationalist movement, should move beyond an exclusive focus for their overt political behavior. Through carefully detailed examination of the archival material, historians in India have demonstrated the transformation of the Indian peasant consciousness along anti-colonial, democratic and class lines. We will base this module on the study of peasants and their mobilizations by nationalist historians such as Mridula Mukherjee. We will also briefly draw upon the works of other historians. In fact, analysis of peasant consciousness and political behavior have disproportionately dwelt on the manifestation in the form of violent mass insurrections. Indeed, they have occasioned grandiloquent historiographical and sociological debates about the revolutionary potential of the peasantry and the unraveling of the nexus between the peasant and nationalist revolutions. On the other hand, there have been studies highlighting the everyday acts of apolitical peasant resistance, the so-called weapons of the weak approach. The advent of subaltern studies on the historiography scene has added another dimension to the ongoing debate between heroic and everyday of the peasant resistance. In this module, we will steer clear of these historiographical extremes. Instead, we will critically look at the role of the peasantry in the Indian national movement in order to prove the making of Indian peasant consciousness. We will make some general remarks about the actual political practices of Indian peasants. At times, we will refer to generalization from other parts of the country and broader historiographical debate. While anchoring the historiographical debate between class and nation in the political world of the peasants of Punjab, Mridula Mukherjee convincingly demonstrates the congruence of the boundaries of influence of peasant and national movements. For the author, anti-imperialist movements created the initial political space in which peasant movement emerged by mobilizing the peasantry into anti-imperialist political action. It created a new political awareness and awakening among them, which made them receptive to a more radical or class-oriented ideas of peasant organization and peasant struggles. The organic relationship between peasant and nationalist movement is manifest in the overlapping political cadres and workers animating them simultaneously. In fact, the ideology of class or economic struggle had no chance of success if it raged itself against nationalism. No wonder even communist success depended on their being good nationalists. According to Mukherjee, peasants and nationalists were fired by a common desire to reach out to each other. In her reading, peasant movements in India were by and large ideologically and organizationally linked to the Indian National Congress, and in that sense were launched as a part of the anti-colonial nationalist struggles. She asserts that even as nationalists were striving to come out of the limitations of the hitherto moderate politics, peasants too were looking beyond the numerous local autonomous sporadic struggles under the traditional leadership. In other words, there had been a dialectically reciprocal relationship between nationalism and peasantry. Forms of mobilization. Peasants have been remarkably adept at the use of modern forms of politics, press, posters, meetings, and pamphlets. Yet the romantic notion of the subaltern violence refuses to die down. Unjustifiably, though, the use of violence has been equated with radical and revolutionary forms of peasant protest, while non-violent means have been seen as pure signs of pro-landlord, pro-bourgeois, and reactionary nature of the peasant movement. This dichotomization between mass agitations and insurrections has been a staple of many great works on forms of peasant protest and mobilization. Of late, the subaltern historians have further glorified the inherent rebelliousness of subaltern classes. While refuting these manneries, Mukherjee posits a relationship between the character of the political struggles and the state and forms of protest. The hegemonic, semi-hegemonic or autocratic, non-hegemonic nature of political struggles and the strength and the weaknesses of the state largely determines a violent or non-violent articulation of the peasant protest. In the Indian context, both the availability of political space within the semi-hegemonic political struggle as well as expediency and calculation of cost organically propelled the PM forward use of non-violent and non-insurrectionary forms of resistance and struggle. According to Mukherjee, ideas of democracy and republic and hence non-violent mass character of the peasant movement have found relatively easier acceptance among the Indian peasants because the traditional functioning of the village landowning community was at least in theory on democratic lines. Mukherjee underlines the singular absence of the idea of land to the tiller or any other constituent of modern anti-feudal consciousness among Indian peasants. Peasants struggle more for restoration of their lost rights in land than in the abolition of landlordism. Most of the struggles were oriented towards upholding the right to subsistence. Any threat to this right, be it the undue increase in land revenue or illegal cesses or abwabs or the disposition of traditional or customary rights in land, provoked widespread resistance. Interestingly, a close examination of the interface between peasant and the nationalist movement also highlights the historic failure of the left popular leadership to ideologically transform peasant consciousness among modern class-based politics. In doing so, it calls for a renewed assessment of the relative merit and viability of class and nation as sources of peasant mobilization. This leads us, among other things, to the need for a clear distinction between peasant consciousness and the consciousness of the peasant leadership. While peasants were more willing to struggle on issues that emanated from sanctioned tradition, past history or notion of legitimacy, the leadership was apparently engaged in organizing peasant resistance along nationalist lines. As a matter of fact, one comes across considerable similarity in demands and issues raised by similar strata of peasantry all over India. The remarkable absence of wage struggle, food riots and the looting of bazaars and haats, that is weekly markets, is another noteworthy characteristic of Indian peasant movement. Even when violence has not been a prerogative of the subaltern, one finds some sort of nationalist regulation of peasant violence. Very often one comes across a popular idea of backward level of class and political consciousness among peasants, something that historians have refuted. One also notes the failure of the peasants, except occasionally, to throw up insiders as leaders. The very subalternity of the vast mass of the Indian peasantry, the backwardness and deprivation have made it historically imperative that the initiative for organization, mobilization and the leadership would either come from the outsiders or insiders who had exposure to the outside world. In this sense, travel and education played a key role in providing leadership to peasant movements and according them a well-articulated political consciousness beyond subaltern insurgency and everyday resistance. One finds an interesting set of people among the leaders of the peasant movements: moneylenders, rich peasants, government officials, ex-terrorists and non-Gandhian urban political workers, nationalist upper layers of rural society and the radicalized sections of the intelligentsia, monks and literate peasants. One also finds a village as a basic unit of politicization and participation as a cohesive social unit. The poor and the low caste members generally did not participate in nationalist mobilization of the peasant. The definition of the village did not include them. Mukherjee writes there was hardly any political participation in any political movement by those at the lowest end of the social and economic scale, the low caste agricultural laborers and artisans. On the other hand, the communist economic struggle had blinded them to the possibilities for political work, for removing social disabilities and introducing new elements into their traditional consciousness. At the same time, colonial state played an important part in shaping the peasant identity and politics, including peasant activism. Taking agrarian policies as his point of departure, Peter Robb discounts the possibility of an unambiguous class identity for cultivators. While detailing the context wherein the colonial state entered the indigenous setting with far-reaching legal and administrative changes, he finds that the discourse of peasant and the organized peasant protest as contingent upon this encounter, if not totally derivative of it. In his reading, the collective experience of the new laws and the new rights laid down the conditions for the emergence of peasant associations. The latter were not simply caste associations by other names. Instead, they had emergent anti-landlord rhetoric and an armory of tenancy rights. In other words, social categories were of mixed basis. Caste, tenure, occupation fused together without any one of them being decisive. It was this fusion and the increasing awareness to a discourse of rights that facilitated an easy reception among the peasantry to the not-so-original diagnosis of peasant conditions by peasant leaders like Swami Sahajanand Saraswati. According to him, very little would have been possible except for the circumstances that colonialism helped create, especially the access to intellectual trends, theories and methods, and some of it through the English language. Arguably, Robb credits colonial rule for making available a different vocabulary to Indians agitating for agrarian and other rights. Here, official categorizations and policies become privileged sites, engendering contested politics of rights and the consolidation of interest constellations as well as their organized articulations. Put it differently, in Robb's reckoning, peasant mobilization is essentially linked to the evolution of the state and its standardizations, the emergence of new institutions, professions and expectations, the growth, increased spread and reduced cost of communication through transport, language and print, the increasing shared economic and political experiences, the awareness of Western ideas in relation to individual or equitable rights. Not only colonial rhetoric emphasized given identities of language, tribe, caste or community, and British policies helped define class interest. Pre-colonial inheritances equally channeled Western influence. After all, European categorizations were not inscribed on a clean state, but had to contend with a set of historically enduring social relations. Siddiqui too examines the interpenetration of peasant movements and nationalist politics. He underlines the point that the complexity of the character of Indian nation is linked to the complexity of agrarian struggles that has underpinned it. What is striking from him is that the peasant movements in some way represented anti-landlord tendencies in the colonial agrarian society. However, there is a historical evidence that the poor peasant protests have strengthened rentier structures as well. At times, anti-moneylender riots have stood opposed to the nationalist political idiom, and movements under a communist leadership have served to strengthen the domination of the rich peasants. More importantly, many peasant movements has reinforced and removed even the post-colonial state. In his panoramic survey of peasant protests, Siddiqui foregrounds a set of disconcerting questions. For example, lack of common leadership for various instances of peasant protest has been one of the abiding features of peasant politics in India. Except for the All India Kisan Sabha in 1936, no other organization ever spoke for the entire Indian peasantry, and as a consequence, peasant demands hardly had an all-India character. Sure enough, the very specificity of each local variant of the agrarian structure, as well as the sheer diversity of peasant communities in India, led to a lack of any generalized acceptance of the program. Siddiqui puts it plainly that ideological distance between the ultimate act of zamindari abolition and other land reforms of the 1950s and the series of peasant agitations over 100 years of British rule was never bridged. Evidently, there is an urgent need to disaggregate the story of the peasant struggle and to undertake an evaluation of the cultural moorings of peasant leadership. Siddiqui's own past historical research has shown that peasant leadership came from the ranks of the Mofussil middle classes and from elements D class. Much of this leadership has tenuous links with the institutional forms of modern state. This culturally heterogeneous and socially stratified leadership stood on a rural-urban continuum and in many manifestations and was strategically relevant to the peasantry. It was this rural-urban intelligentsia who produced mobilizational literature for the peasantry. It was they who helped shape the peasant demands and who represented peasant interest in the nationalist press to integrate the little traditions of peasantry with Indian nationalism. Yet the leadership's reinforcement of culture and community served to widen the distance between town and country and furthered the ideological disarticulation of the Indian politics locally. Very often, processes of political mobilization did not respond to the secular formulae of class struggle. Even when some form of class alignments were present in peasant protests, much of the mobilization was a consequence of those features of Indian society which in their customary routing did not share the modernity of the urban social contract. One does not fail to notice the differences in approach between Robb and Siddiqui. For the latter, the pervasiveness of religious beliefs were the way of invoking the sanction of village deities for protest initiatives, the frequent recourse to caste-based sanctions for violation of food taboos for enlisting the wider support and participation of caste members, deification of Gandhi, regard of the laity of the renouncer and ascetic as the leaders are evidence enough of the temporarily distinctive character of the peasant leadership. The overlapping of religious beliefs and symbols with social identity of the community and the caste provided many of the symbols for protest in places as different as Uttar Pradesh, Bardoli, Bihar, Bengal. In Malabar, Islam was a source of cohesion among the poor peasantry and for the linking up of this community with the urban-based sabhas of the richer Muslims. Steering clear of the rhetoric of the Marxian left which celebrated peasant radicalism and elogized its ascendance as a prelude to revolutionary upheaval, Siddiqui engages with the problematic of the writing of peasant history where contemporary concerns can no longer be read back into the peasant history. More importantly, he attempts to bridge the distinction between the past before independence and the years since with a view to reformulate historical categories. Not surprisingly, he gestures towards tracing the roots of peasant populism and the clinical manipulation through electoral politics in independent India in the historically evolving character of peasant leadership. True, the historicity of peasant insurgency in modern India has come a full circle. To quote Siddiqui, the deeper sinews of community economy, traditional moralities and customary bindings have transmuted through land reform and in a strange marriage with the social contract of political democracy into becoming a mix of casteist movement, communal politics and class struggles. To gain perspective on this legacy remains a serious challenge for the historiography of peasant movements in India, both before and after independence. The issue is not merely that the progressive peasant movements of yesteryear have turned conservative, both politically and socially. It also begs the question as to how in the past 50-60 years the character of the nation itself has undergone change. Drawing upon its Jawan and Kisan, this nation has no qualms in crushing militant radical movements of the rural poor and tribals. According to Gould, in terms of political expression, peasant ideologies and mobilization styles present a melange of both modern and nativist characteristics. In fact, these characteristics resonated well with Mahatma's symbolism and traditional imagery of Ram Raj, which had historically legitimized collective action among the peasantry. Agrarian discontent of this halfway house variety offered enough room for selective co-optation and ideological manipulation that marked the Congress party's interface with agrarian unrest in the Gandhian phase. The way Congress roped in the peasantry in may have loosened its hold over the latter had the Congress socialist faction not forced the party to at least tacitly adopt a semblance of Marxist orientation to peasant mobilization. In fact, Gould's use of the expression Babas, non-cooperators and revolutionaries assumes that tenants had class-driven concerns whereas Congress leadership had nationalist concern. Be that as may be, Marxist millennium was never on the political agenda of the cultivating elite and middle class, who were more interested in obtaining legal titles to the land they cultivated as tenants of different sorts. Of course, local level elections opened up the class cleavages based on status discrepancies between high caste and middle caste cultivators, and they percolated upward through the political system by way of democratic use of power, of ethnic solidarity and numbers. Middle caste owner cultivators finally did succeed in challenging the authority of the long entrenched upper class establishment. Charan Singh was the principal architect of this middle class reclassification, who frequently made use of the class attributes of the middle caste as an increasingly self-conscious basis for differential political mobilization. In the worlds of gold, in the culturally multiplex world of Indian society, interest-based mobilization, howsoever universalistic, can hardly avoid enmeshment in the particularizing power of the ethnically structured social formation that prowl the country's democratically structured political arenas. Expectedly, no single uniform class thesis can provide a basis to account for variations in social context, historical time, and systematic economic factors in a large and diversified country like ours. At the most, one can discern certain common threads running through the historical manifestations of agrarian unrest. For example, caste hierarchies have everywhere correlated with differing relations to the means of production. Landowners have been concentrated in the higher caste, small-scale cultivators and tenants have come from the middle range caste, and landless laborers have come from the lower caste. Depending on the regional agrarian system and culture, details would vary, but the underlying structural relationships have always had the potential for class formation and class conflict. Such relationships have embodied inequities in wealth, social conditions, and status deprivation, reaching to critical levels of intolerability. But we know that mere intolerability of conditions does not lead to protest and mobilization. Other critical features go into its making, and they have been issues of scholarly debates and perspectives and ideological stances. On the contrary, Pinch underlines the need to accord more attention to religion and religious belief for a fuller understanding of what empire meant to the individuals who lived it. He contests the recent post-colonial depictions of British India as the site of unidirectional mental colonization by rationalizing scientific empire on a pliable pre-modern Orient. For him, religious culture offers us a peep into the world of peasant mobilization. This is in sync with his overall emphasis on reading Bhakti into the British Indian history. In this framework, British Indian experience cannot be reduced to colonial antipathy enacted on racism, violence, anxiety and displacement. He joins the issue with mainstream historiography of colonialism that discounts Indian participation in the empire and fails to acknowledge that British India was more of an imperial than a colonial entity. Hagen looks at the environmental context of food and agrarian relations in Gangetic Plain, where biomass depletion and arable expansions were marked by continuing supply of cultivable lands. As the availability of these increasingly marginal soils came to an end towards the end of the 19th century, the stark picture of rural social distress began to appear. In his reckoning, limits to biomass abundant extensive agriculture made the Gangetic Middle region the epicenter of and the most active area of peasant land conflict in South Asia. Thus, peasant protests and mobilizations would have taken place with or without the nationalist appropriation of the peasant cause. Friends, in conclusion to this module on Indian peasantry and the national movement, we have focused on how class contradiction exists within peasantry, therefore helping us to lead to the question of peasant leadership. Further, linking up peasant politics with national movement, we have also looked into the question of commercialization, especially in terms of agriculture. Further, we have looked into agrarian strategies, especially and focused on the place of peasants in the colonial imperial epistemology. Thank you.